Hello and welcome back to Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, July 1st. It's also a great pleasure to be joined here in our virtual studio by two distinguished journalists we've had the pleasure of having on before. Howard Weiss-Tisman is the Southern Vermont reporter for Vermont Public Radio. Great to have you back with us, Howard. And Greg Sukiennik is the Vermont State House reporter, State House editor for the Bennington Banner, Manchester Journal, and Brattleboro Reformer. Greg, good to have you back with us as well.
Sure, glad to be here, though I'm coming to you from a undisclosed location where I cannot show my video identity if you see the blank screen.
Last Friday, the legislature wrapped up business, at least for until August 25th, I believe. They're going to be going back. They took care of some immediate business, left a few things on the table for when they return later this summer. But Greg, get us up to speed here. Where did the legislature leave things off, and what are some of the next steps we could look forward to?
Well, thanks, Andrew. It's about 3 weeks or so into this, my coverage of the State House. It's like parachuting into a tornado. There's a lot going on, and enough to keep your head spinning. But if I could sum up really quickly, they completed a budget for the first quarter of fiscal 20, about $1 billion in funds from the federal CARES Act of coronavirus relief funds. That's going to some businesses, to the health, a large $275 million just for the healthcare segment alone. Some funds for foreclosure relief, for rent and utility relief, some money for education, for helping schools to open up with COVID precautions. They also, if that wasn't enough, tackled some pressing systemic racism and police reform that became a necessity in reaction to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th. Despite everything they were doing, and despite a short time frame, a number of bills made it at least past one house. One of them, Senate Bill 219, which addressed mandatory race reporting, mandatory body camera use for the state police, and criminalizing chokeholds and other prohibited restraints, managed to pass both houses. That was what kept them going up until the evening of Friday. They did adjourn on Friday. And there's about $140 or so million left in coronavirus relief funds that they can try to use. They're trying to save about $100 million of that for the $100 million hole in the education fund. Just talked to Tim Ash, State Senator Tim Ash, the President Pro Tem today, and he described the state's looming budget deficit as about $330 million. So there was no shortage of work for them to do when they get back in August.
I want to return to that a little bit later in our time here. Will be, I suppose, hospitals and medical care. Howard, I know that's an area you've been covering a bit. What is our situation like in the medical scene here in Vermont now, 3 or 4 months into the whole pandemic era?
Right. Well, like Greg said, the healthcare system did get a big chunk of the money that was allocated. There's about $275 million put into a provider relief fund. And just to back up a little bit, it's important to remember that even before COVID-19 hit, a lot of Vermont hospitals were in really tough shape. About half of the hospitals lost money last year. And so before COVID, there was a lot of talk about righting the ship, about making some adjustments to the hospital system. And then, of course, when COVID hit, the hospitals really got hammered on a lot of fronts. They had to put off all elective procedures, and that's where a lot of hospitals, make their money doing knee replacements, hip replacements. That was all put on hold. They had to invest a lot of money in protective equipment and paying overtime, etc. So they're coming out of this in really tough shape. The people I spoke to at the Vermont Association of Hospitals and Healthcare Systems says, this money is not going to even get them to square one. They still have a lot of area to make up. And so it's a lot of money. It's going to help things a little bit, but there are still a lot of questions to be answered. I'm actually writing a story right now. Before COVID, the Green Mountain Care Board was asking some of these hospitals that were in really tough shape to put together sustainability plans and kind of take a long-term look at our healthcare system and where we can make adjustments, where hospitals work together more. They're going to talk about that again at their meeting on July 15th, I believe the date is, and trying to look beyond COVID a little bit, which is hard to do because we don't know how long this is going to go on. We don't know really what the new normal is going to look like or anything like that. But they're trying to look at the whole healthcare system. Also in that money was a big bailout for the Brattleboro retreat and the mental health care system. And wrapped up in that legislation was a whole lot of extra provisions that are going to force the retreat to kind of look at their operations again, look at their long-term stability. As part of accepting this money, the retreat is going to have to put together a package that addresses some of the issues that have been going on with their union, with workers there. It's been really rocky over the past year or two. And something else that's really interesting right now, the Brattleboro Retreat writes its own budget, answers to its own board. But by 2024, I believe, the retreat is going to have its budget approved every year by the Green Mountain Care Board. So in a lot of ways, this legislation is kind of bringing the Brattleboro Retreat into the state's healthcare system. So it's kind of wonky, but it's really a very, very big change. And the only reason I think the retreat was willing to go along with this is because they also were losing millions of dollars a year. I think the most recent financial analysis found that they had lost about $5 million over the past 2 or 3 years, and that's not sustainable either. So big changes for Vermont's healthcare system coming out of COVID.
Mm-hmm. And before we leave this topic, I was just wondering, the Springfield Hospital before the pandemic began was, as I understood it, on fairly rocky financial territory. I think they were in bankruptcy, actually.
Yeah, that bankruptcy is, yep, that's ongoing. I'm looking at their court records every day. The most recent development there is that they were supposed to put together their bankruptcy plan by the end of June. It's kind of when they filed bankruptcy just about a year ago, and they were supposed to put a plan together. And of course, COVID once again is stepping in, and the administration at Springfield Hospital saying that COVID just threw them for such a loop that they need a little more time to put together that plan. The bankruptcy judge has not yet ruled on that. There'll probably be a ruling very soon. They're asking for another 6 months to put that plan together to figure out how they can survive. Of course, COVID hit them, but they are going to get a big influx of this federal money, and so it's going to be interesting to see how that all kind of sugars off in the end. They're still hurting, but I think the federal money is going to help a little bit, I think.
Well, all right. Well, we'll definitely keep our eyes peeled on that one. Meanwhile, as the legislature, well, I was about to say, as the legislature leaves Montpelier, but they really didn't, because they had already left Montpelier and they've been working remotely for the past couple of months. A couple of things are also happening. 2 days ago, June 29th, was the first day of early voting in Vermont, leading up to the August 11th state primary, where we're going to have a couple of interesting races, both statewide and local. And just looking at the governor's race, it's kind of interesting. I just wanted to pick both of your brains on how you were reading things as we kind of now get into the sort of the final phase of this. there are three Democratic candidates who seem to be vying for the party's nomination. That would be Rebecca Holcomb, the former education secretary, Patrick Winburn, an attorney from Bennington, admittedly a long shot candidate there, and also Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. I guess we'll start with them, and then we can move over to the Republican side, which is also kind of interesting because incumbent Phil Scott, of course, has said he's not going to campaign. He's too busy, guiding and navigating the state through the pandemic, and that's going to absorb all of his time and energy. But I guess, Greg, over to you. What is your sense of how the politics of all this are shaking out, at least on the Democratic side?
Well, on the Democratic side, it's been interesting to see the way that the campaign has begun. Certainly, it began with Rebecca Holcomb, the former state secretary of education, taking sort of an aggressive tack in her race against Patrick Winburn and David Zuckerman, getting into past vote that the lieutenant governor had about one of the exemptions for vaccines. It's kind of different this year because the typical cycle of campaign events and forums and fundraisers is so much different with the way that the pandemic has changed ability for that sort of one-to-one retail style politics that Vermont is known for, where it becomes there's still opportunities for communication, but they're on the screen like we are right now. So I'd be interested to see how that. I think in such a situation, my informed opinion, we'll see how well informed once the votes are counted, is that the lieutenant governor's name recognition does help him in this situation. Given, Rebecca Holcomb was education secretary. That is a statewide role. However, that does involve her in Act 46, and people have different feelings about that. So on the Republican side, hard to say. I mean, Phil Scott isn't campaigning per se, but in a way, because he's got a regular COVID-19 briefing in which he's telling people about what the state's doing and the steps that they're taking, and the overall perception of the way that the state has managed COVID-19 so far. So he's not campaigning, but I think, there is a sort of subtle reminder that, hey, Phil Scott's your governor and this is what he's doing. So, and that same dynamic about being able to sort of get out at retail, don't know if how that might make a difficult job even that much more difficult for John Clark, who is I believe Orleans or Essex County attorney, who is challenging on the Republican.
And Act Republican, I believe, is.
Yes.
What's your sense of things over there, Howard?
Greg touched on a couple things that's interesting. We had some interesting conversations at VPR. We've been covering the governor's press conference every day and running it, gavel to gavel, if you will. And we've decided that we're going to stop that in a couple of weeks, because even though the governor is saying that he's not holding press conferences and campaigning, he's been getting 3 2-hour open slots all across the airwaves. So we thought it made sense leading up to the primary to stop covering those. The governor actually announced today he's moving those to 2 a week. But nonetheless, it gives him a platform. I did some kind of back of the envelope numbers over the past few press conferences, and it is interesting in that he's getting a lot of non-COVID questioning at these press conferences. So there's an argument that these are important. There's a lot of interest in the pandemic and the response, but he's getting a lot of questions about about racism, about mail-in voting, about his thoughts on the legislature. So the line definitely gets blurred there.
That's certainly gotten us a little bit.
Yeah, and bottom line, I think it's going to be pretty tough to run against him, whatever he does, whether he does campaigning or debates or whatnot. I think that it's pretty widely accepted that he's done a pretty good job so far of managing this really once in a generation pandemic. So we'll see how that sugars off. And again, as Greg said, you know, the Democratic campaign as well is like nothing we've ever seen. Whenever these campaigns happen, the big question is, how do you get that name recognition out there? How do you reach people in other parts of the state? And most of the time that means you travel down there and you shake hands and you talk to people, and that's not going to happen now. So, you know, how are the three candidates going to get their messages out there, reach voters? Plus, we have the mail-in voting, which we talked a little bit about before we came on. Maybe a lot more people are going to be involved in the primary this year. It's hard to say how that's going to impact if more voting is going to happen. And again, as Greg said, I think that Rebecca Holcomb did get a little jump on thing. She started campaigning before David Zuckerman. Lieutenant Governor was busy up in the State House. So it's going to be fascinating. And we're, you know, just about a month away, you know, 6 weeks. So it's going to be a busy month or so leading up to it. It's going to be fascinating to watch it for sure.
They're both capable candidates as well, both Rebecca and David.
Oh, yeah.
Good speakers, intelligent. They've
With
already
long
claimed
records,
yeah.
Like you said, Act 46, whether it's good or bad, both of them have been around a while and, you know, have been at the forefront of a lot of issues in Vermont for sure.
And David does have the sort of the Bernie Sanders wing of the party sort of imprimatur of you know, there's already a good deal of support from that campus lined up behind him. So can we talk about the lieutenant governor's race as well, do you think?
Sure. Because that's a pretty interesting with a lot of candidates in there.
I think there's a shorter list of Vermonters who aren't running for lieutenant governor.
Yeah.
And there's a number of Southern Vermont connections to that as well. I mean, Molly Gray, on the Democratic side, Molly Gray does have some Windham County ties, some family ties to Townsend, I believe it is.
And the endorsement of former Governor Peter Shumlin, who apparently has known her since she was a little kid, I guess.
There's that. Brenda Siegel, who ran for governor on the Democratic side 2 years ago, is also in the race from Newfane for lieutenant governor. We also have on the Republican side, we have Meg Hansen, who's a Manchester resident, and that's the local connections in those two parties. On the Democratic side, you also have Tim Ash, who has some statewide recognition as the Senate President pro tem. Deborah Ingram, state senator from Burlington, less recognition down in this part of the state, I think, but remains to be seen. The early returns on Molly Gray's campaign finances, she was doing a pretty good job in fundraising. And Brenda Siegel does have some experience in running this race, and a lot of folks are sort of impressed by her commitment to activism. So I think there's a couple ways you can handicap the race, but I think at this point it's a bit of a toss-up, and I'm not willing to go on the limb quite yet.
Yeah.
I think if nothing else, it'll help us get our mind off the pandemic for 6 weeks.
There was always that.
Yeah.
And we've got a race for, on the Republican side, you've got Meg Hansen, who does have some conservative backing, and also Scott Milne, who's run a number of statewide races before. And so he comes with some name recognition.
And money.
And money. And then just really quickly, Auditor of Accounts has a Democratic primary, and that involves Linda Joy Sullivan from Dorset, running against the incumbent Doug Hoffer in the primary. You usually don't see primaries in down ticket races, perhaps, but here we are.
Yeah.
And so it'll be interesting to see how much interest she and Doug can generate in what the auditor does, and getting folks to get engaged in that race.
It will be interesting to see in the context of the pandemic if more people opt to vote by mail for safety reasons as opposed to going to the polls. And it'll be interesting to see how many polling stations do drive-in voting or something like some kind of thing like that, where you wouldn't actually have to get out of your car and go into the town hall or wherever. But we'll have to save that conversation for another time, because in the time we got left, I wanted to return to a point both of you mentioned earlier, and that's this whole business about the police reforms and defunding the police and Act, S219, I believe, was one act the legislature passed. I don't believe the governor signed it yet. That's the one where police would be not able to use chokeholds and other forms of kind of lethal force. I was just wondering, where do you guys both see this going? Is this another case where there's a big uproar for a month or so and it sort of slowly fades away, or is this an issue that's going to hang around and be a factor going forward right through till the November elections?
Well, it's kind of two parallel discussions going on. I think that there's what the legislature did and how that impacts local police forces and how those actions play out on the ground, but also in these days of pandemic and town budgets are strapped and the state budget is strapped. I've been interested to see how up in Burlington just yesterday they had a vote on their budget, which kind of played out in the police force and how they're going to be hiring people. So I don't think it's going away. I think it's going to be interesting conversations town to town, maybe not till town meeting next year when people are talking about budgets and looking at their local police forces. And in a lot of towns, police and fire, make up a big chunk of their budgets. And it's going to be interesting to see, what people want to continue supporting in their communities.
I did get the sense from the lawmakers who spoke on this, and this has a heavy Southern Vermont flavor to it because Senator Jeanette White from Windham County and as chair of the Government Ops Committee, and Senator Dick Sears of Bennington, who chairs the Judiciary Committee, were both directly involved, which prompted my interest in covering it closely. There was a lot of spoken commitment and some legislative commitment. There was a sunset clause inserted in the House by the House into S219 to make sure that they actually come back to it and that this isn't the end of the conversation. Just the further they dug in the Judiciary Committee, the more they realized that this touched on other laws that also had that where the language was badly in need of a rewrite because of terminology that goes back to the common law era. And there's still questions about the Criminal Justice Training Center and whether that should be under the aegis of the Department of Public Safety rather than an independent agency. There's still a lot to talk about, and I did hear a lot of commitment from members of the legislature that they want to come back to this in August, that they're not done, because I don't think that they want to be perceived as they see that this time things really do seem different, perhaps because of the nature of the protests that followed George Floyd's death and the fact that we all got to see those horrifying images. And I do think that, certainly here in Bennington, there's a lot of focus on police reform, given the International Association of Chiefs of Police report on the Bennington Police Department and the Select Board's commitment to try to put those reforms into place and into action. So my sense is this isn't going away. Maybe it might go to the back burner for a while once we sort of get in, once this August session gets finished and we go back to, waiting for January. But I don't think we're done here.
I'm wondering, how you guys feel about the interpretation of defunding the police. I mean, at face value, that sounds like the police budget of a local municipality gets cut by a certain amount, and that is what it is. But there's another school of thought around that has that money being reallocated to like mental health services and social workers and taking some of the burdens off the police force that maybe they're not, as well trained for as, let's say, those mental health or social workers are. But I guess there's also a bit of a complexity around that because some of those same mental health and social workers are funded statewide, whereas police forces are funded locally. I'm wondering if there's some sort of workaround on that or how that's all going to play out.
Yeah, it's such a complex issue. I went to a forum in Brattleboro that the Brattleboro police hosted, and they answered questions, and it just all gets tied up in itself. People were talking about defunding the police, and the police chief was up there saying, well, we can't do that because we're answering domestic violence calls, and we're dealing with homelessness, and we're dealing with the opioid problem, and everything he talked about were, mental health and social issues that questionably should not be handled by the police. So what he's saying is the police need the money because they're dealing with all of these issues, but whether or not it should be the police dealing with these issues, you know what I mean? It kind of, you keep going around in circles with the whole thing. So if you pull that money out, like you said, Andrew, and put it into social services, it seems like it would just be a whole different way of thinking, and a change like that, I think, is going to take a very long time. I think, because you're talking about big structural changes, both in social services and in the police system. So, I mean, I'm not saying that we're not going to get there, but I think something like that is going to take more than a year or two to address.
I do have a couple quick points on that. First is during the House presentation before the caucus on S219, Representative Nadir Hashim of Dummerston, who is stepping down after one term as a state rep. He represents the Wyndham 4 district. He was a Vermont state trooper. He was talking about a situation where he had responded to a call in Saxton's River, I believe it was, where he and his fellow troopers were being fired on by a person who was having a mental health incident. And he talked about how, in one hand, he was thinking about, making sure that he and his fellow troopers got home safely. But in retrospect, he was thinking about, maybe it would have been more efficient if there was a mental health worker who was embedded with the state police barracks, who was able to respond to that call and maybe de-escalate the situation before someone pulled a gun and started firing. My second thought I had really quickly is that when you're talking about defunding the police, it's not really, and by defunding we mean sort of deallocating some of the things that they do. It's not really one size fits all, especially here in part of the state where some departments are very small and getting smaller. Bellows Falls, a small department, which is, had some overtime issues and some personnel issues. Win Hall, which I think is, only a few officers. Manchester, which is only, I think, 7 full-time officers. I could be wrong on that number. Another thing that came up during testimony is that even these larger departments that are dealing with data collection, apparently from what one witness testified, the state police have one person who handles data entry for all this race data from traffic stops and does it as a sideline from what their actual job description is. So for some departments, I think there's concern that if we start taking away resources, that there's not going to be much of a department left.
Well, this is one of those subjects we could, again, talk about for another half an hour. I got a funny feeling, but we're going to have to leave it there for now. But I want to thank you both for taking the time out of what I know are some busy schedules to share some of your insights with us. Howard Weiss-Tisman, reporter, Southern Vermont reporter for Vermont Public Radio. Greg Sukiennik, Vermont State House editor for the Reformer, the Banner, and the Journal. I want to thank you guys both very much for being with us today on Press Pass, and we'll be in touch.